Welcome back, deep divers. Have you ever stopped to think about that really deep human drive we all seem to have? To make a name for ourselves,
Mm.
to leave some kind of mark, build something lasting, something that says, "Hey, we were here, we matter."
Yeah, it's powerful, isn't it? Almost instinctive.
It really is ancient, you could say,
Mm.
and it can fuel incredible things, amazing achievements. But well, sometimes it has these completely unexpected consequences.
That's certainly true.
And when you look around at our world today, this incredible, sometimes kind of chaotic mix of cultures and languages.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder, from a biblical viewpoint, where did all this amazing diversity actually come from?
That's the big question these chapters tackle, really.
Right. So today we're doing a deep dive into really significant, but I think often kind of glossed over chapters of Genesis, chapters 10 and 11.
Yeah, they're easy to skip, maybe, but they're crucial.
They absolutely are. They act like this vital bridge in the whole foundational story of humanity, connecting that post-flood world we talked about before to, well, a totally new chapter in God's plan.
Exactly. Chapter 10, which people often call the Table of Nations, it's almost like, an ancient map, an ethnographic map.
Right.
It details the descendants of Noah's sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and shows how they started spreading out across the earth. But it's more than just a list. It hints at patterns, sets things up.
And then chapter 11 hits us with one of the most, iconic stories in the whole Bible, right? The Tower of Babel.
Absolutely iconic and profoundly dramatic. It tackles that human ambition head on and gives this explanation for why that initial unity fractured.
So that's our mission today. We want to really unpack these chapters, get beyond just the surface story.
Work out the key insights.
Exactly. Understand how the world got populated, why we speak all these different languages, and critically, how these ancient stories aren't just footnotes. They lay this indispensable foundation for everything that comes next in the Bible, especially, the story of Abraham.
It's all connected. Seeing those connections is key.
Okay, let's really lean into this. We'll start our narrative walkthrough by tracing these lineages, laying out this incredible map you mentioned from Genesis chapter 10.
Yeah.
But let's try not to just rattle off names. Let's understand what they represent.
Good plan. So Genesis 10 kicks off by presenting the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood.
Right after the command to multiply.
Precisely. God tells Noah in Genesis 9.1, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." So chapter 10 is basically showing the first steps of that happening. Noah's family, the only survivors, they start spreading out, repopulating the world. It's setting the stage demographically, culturally.
God's plan starting to unfold through people.
Exactly. Through human agency.
And what jumps out right away, even as they start spreading, is that distinct groups begin to form. It's not just a random scattering.
No, not at all. The text is very deliberate about outlining these family lines. And in doing that, it immediately introduces this idea of distinct peoples, specific lands, emerging identities.
An organized unfolding, you could say.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it. It starts with the descendants of Japheth. That's Genesis 10, verses 2 to 4. We see names like Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Tiras.
Names that echo through later history and other texts.
They do. Gomer is often linked to groups like the Sumerians, sort of Proto-Europeans, maybe in Turkey or the Black Sea area. Javan is pretty consistently identified with the Ionians, the ancient Greeks, Aegean peoples.
So generally north and west of the Fertile Crescent.
Generally, yes. That seems to be the trajectory. But the really crucial part is the summary statement in verse 5. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations.
Wow. That's early on to be talking about different tongues and nations.
It is. It's a profound statement right there. It establishes this linguistic and national diversity from the outset. It signals a world of distinct peoples, the Gentiles, separate from the line that will eventually lead to Israel. It's painting this global human tapestry from the get-go.
Okay, so diversity isn't just a later thing. It's baked into the early post-flood geography. But then we shift to Ham's descendants, and someone pretty famous pops up.
Ah, yes, the descendants of Ham. That's verses 6 through 20. You've got Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. And you're right, this is where it gets, well, really interesting because we meet Nimrod.
Nimrod, yeah, that name carries some weight, doesn't it? What's his deal? Why is he so important here?
Well, he's described in pretty striking terms. He was a mighty one in the earth, a mighty hunter before the Lord.
Mighty hunter before the Lord. What does that actually mean?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Scholars have debated that for ages. Does before the Lord mean, in God's sight, maybe even favored by God for his skill? Or does it mean in defiance of the Lord, like setting himself up against God?
Given what comes later in chapter 11,
Yeah.
maybe the defiant one.
Many lean that way, yes. It fits the pattern. But beyond just being a hunter, he's presented as this foundational leaver, a strong man, a real mover and shaker in that early world.
A city builder, right?
Exactly. He's explicitly called a city builder and the founder of the first kingdom mentioned after the flood. The text says, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar.
Babel. There it is. Right at the start of the kingdom.
Right there. So the Tower of Babel story later doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's linked to Ham's line, and specifically to this early kingdom founded by Nimrod in Shinar. He also founded Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, Resen, major Assyrian cities later on.
So he represents this rise of centralized power,
Mm.
urbanization, kingdoms, empire almost.
Precisely. The birth of empire, you could say.
Yeah.
Human ambition starting to take a very organized, structured form.
Incredible foreshadowing with Babel being the start of his kingdom. What about the other lines from Ham? Where do they fit in?
Well, beyond Nimrod, you have Mizraim, which is consistently the name for Egypt in the Bible.
Okay, Egypt, that's huge later on.
Absolutely. And Mizraim's descendants include groups like the Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim. And the text specifically adds, out of whom came Philistim and also Caphtorim.
The Philistines. So their origin is traced back to Ham through Egypt. Wow. Major adversaries for Israel later.
Exactly. The connections are being laid down. Then there's Canaan, another son of Ham. His descendants include Sidon, Heth, who become the Hittites, and then all those Oberites that populate the land of Canaan later. Jebusites, Amorites, Girgasites, Hivites, and so on.
The people living in the Promised Land before Israel gets there.
The very same. The text says their families were spread abroad and even describes their territory from Sidon down towards Gaza over towards Sodom and Gomorrah. It's basically mapping out the future land of Israel.
So these groups were the early inhabitants. That context is crucial for understanding Abraham and the conquest later.
Absolutely critical. And again, the summary for Ham's line follows the pattern. These are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. Diversification, territorial settlement, it's all there.
It's striking how many of these groups, especially from Ham, become major players, often antagonists later. It really is like a casting call. Okay, let's cover the final line, Shem.
Right, the descendants of Shem. That's Genesis 10.2131. This line includes Elam, linked to Persia, Ashur, Assyria, another big empire, Arphaxad, Lud, maybe Lydia, and Aram, the Arameans.
Aramaic language comes from Aram.
That's right. It became a major language across the Near East, the language Jesus himself likely spoke day to day. But a key figure here is Eber. He's called the father of all the children of Eber.
Eber. Sounds like Hebrew.
Exactly. It's widely believed the term Hebrew derives from Eber, so this line is the direct line leading to Abraham and ultimately to Israel.
Okay, so this is the chosen line emerging.
Yes. And within this line, there's a really interesting detail. One of Eber's sons is named Peleg, and the text explicitly says why. For in his days was the earth divided.
Divided. That sounds significant. A hint of something to come.
A huge hint. It's like this little narrative breadcrumb directly pointing towards the major event of division and scattering that we're about to get in the next chapter. It ties everything together beautifully.
So chapter 10 wraps up with this summary. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. It sounds, kind of neat and tidy. Everyone's spreading out, dividing up the land.
Almost like a natural process fulfilling God's command.
Right. But then, bam, we hit chapter 11, and the tone shifts dramatically. It feels like chapter 10 gave us the map of discursion, and now chapter 11 is coming in to explain the why. Why does that division become so absolute, so fundamental? What's the dynamic here?
That's a great way to put it. Chapter 11 opens with this really striking statement that, like you said, seems almost contradictory at first glance. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech.
One language. After chapter 10 just talked about different tongues.
Exactly. It sets up this picture of a unified humanity, a single point of origin, before the linguistic divisions of Chapter 10 really took hold or were perhaps fully cemented. Chapter 11 is basically providing the backstory, the ultimate cause for why the Earth became so divided in Peleg's day. It's explaining the origin of that diversity.
Okay, so this united humanity, all speaking the same language, they journey from the east, and where do they settle? A plain in the land of Shinar.
Shinar. The exact same place where Nimrod's kingdom began, with Babel as its starting point. The geography is deliberate.
And they don't just settle, do they? They get ambitious, they start building.
Oh, yeah. And the text highlights their technology. It says they decided, go to, let us make brick and burn them throughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar.
Brick for stone, slime for mortar. That sounds specific.
It's incredibly specific and historically accurate for Mesopotamia. Baked brick was high-tech then, much stronger than sun-dried. And slime is bitumen, natural asphalt or tar, a fantastic waterproof mortar. Stone was rare there, so this was advanced engineering for monumental building.
Ziggurats.
Precisely what it evokes. This wasn't just building houses. This was a unified, sophisticated, large-scale construction project. It shows impressive human ingenuity and collective will.
And their goals. They spell them out pretty clearly, don't they? It's not just about having a city.
Not at all. Their motivations are laid bare in verse 4. Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth.
Wow. Okay, unpack that. Make us a name.
That screams ambition, right? A desire for fame, renown, a lasting legacy built by their own hands, their own power, self-glorification.
And a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. Literally trying to get to God, or is it symbolic?
Probably more symbolic. Like the ziggurats were meant to be connection points, but it definitely implies reaching for the divine, maybe trying to achieve some kind of self-made security or status independent of God, establishing their own access, maybe.
And the last part, lest we be scattered. They're actively trying to avoid spreading out.
Yes, that's crucial. God had commanded them to fill the earth, to scatter and multiply. Their building project, their desire to centralize and stay together, was a direct act of disobedience. It was resistance to God's plan for humanity. They were trying to build security against God's command.
So this huge statement of human intent, human capability, human defiance. And then God steps in.
He does. Verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. It's this vivid picture of God taking notice, paying close attention.
He sees their unity, their technology, their ambition.
And he assesses the situation. His words are chilling in a way. Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do.
Nothing will be restrained from them. What's the danger there? Is God threatened?
I don't think it's about God feeling threatened. It's more about the potential for unchecked human imagination and ambition when unified like this, without moral limits, without accountability to him. Where could that lead? If they can conceive anything and have the unified power to do anything, the potential for evil, for arrogance, for destruction becomes limitless. It's a dangerous trajectory for humanity itself.
Right. Like power without restraint. So God's response is decisive.
Utterly decisive. He says, go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. He targets the very source of their unified power, their common language.
Confusion, misunderstanding, cooperation breaks down.
Instantly, and the immediate result. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Their great project halts. Their worst fear scattering becomes the reality, imposed by God because of their defiance.
And the name itself becomes a permanent reminder.
Exactly, verse 9. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Babel sounds like the Hebrew word for confusion, balo. The name literally means confusion. It marks the event that fractured humanity's communication and forced their dispersion across the globe.
So after this huge climax, this global event of shattering unity, the narrative zooms back in, doesn't it? It returns to a genealogy, but a very specific one.
That's right. It's a significant shift in focus. After the universal scattering at Babel, the lens narrows dramatically. We leave the big picture of all nations and focus intensely on the generations of Shem.
Back to that line we saw in chapter 10.
Exactly. Tracing it down through Arphaxad, Salah, Eber, Peleg-him again, Reu, Serug, Nahor, and finally Terah. It's drawing a direct line towards Abraham.
And you mentioned Peleg again. In his days, the earth was divided. Makes perfect sense now after Babel.
Perfect sense. It shows that Chapter 10 wasn't necessarily strictly chronological before Chapter 11, but maybe thematic, with Peleg's name anticipating the Babel event. It highlights the internal consistency. Also, notice the lifespans in this genealogy.
They're getting shorter, aren't they, compared to before the flood?
Significantly shorter. It's a subtle reminder, perhaps, of the lingering effects of sin, the diminishing vitality post-flood, moving further away from that initial creation ideal.
Okay, so this specific line culminates in one family that changes everything.
Absolutely. We land on the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. Here's the starting point for the patriarchal narratives. The focus shifts from all humanity to this one family.
And we get some key details about them right away. Haran dies young.
Yes, died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees.
Ur of the Chaldees. We talk about that Mesopotamian city, ziggurats, echoes of Babel's ambition, perhaps.
Definitely a center of that culture. Abram comes out of that world. And then the other crucial detail, slipped in almost casually, but so important. But Sarai was barren. She had no child.
Right at the point where God's plan is going to involve making a great nation from Abram. Talk about setting up a challenge.
It immediately signals that whatever nation comes from Abram and Sarai will be a work of divine power, a miracle, not just natural human capability. It requires faith from the very start.
So Terah starts the journey, takes Abram, Lot, Sarai. They leave Ur, aiming for Canaan, but they stop in Haran.
Yes, they get partway. They came unto Haran and dwelt there. It's this initial move away from Ur, a step towards the promise, but not the final destination yet. It perfectly sets the stage for God's call to Abram in the very next chapter.
Okay, let's step back and look at the characters, or rather the main character in the Babel story. It's not really one person, is it? It's humanity acting together.
That's a really important insight. Unlike Noah, the focus here is on the collective, the children of men, the text calls them, and their motivations, revealed in that key verse, Genesis 11.4, are so revealing about us, about human nature.
Let's break those down again. First, that fear.
Yeah, the fear of being scattered.
Right.
Lest we be scattered. It's a desire for security, for unity, for sticking together. Understandable, maybe, especially after the flood, but it directly contradicts God's command. Fill the earth. Spread out, multiply. So their unity, born of fear, becomes an act of resistance. They're choosing self-preservation over obedience to God's design for creation.
Okay, then the pride. Let us make us a name.
That's pure ambition for self-glorification, isn't it? They want fame, significance, a legacy built by their own power, their own achievements, not seeking God's blessing or glory, but their own name. It echoes that desire in Eden to be like God's, defining good and evil, defining significance for themselves.
Building their own kingdom, basically.
Exactly. Establishing their own identity and worth apart from the Creator.
And third, that desire for security, tied to the tower reaching to heaven.
Right. It suggests a desire for self-sufficiency, building their own protection, maybe even subconsciously against future divine judgment like the flood. Trying to create a secure world on their own terms, with their own technology, bypassing reliance on God. It's about control, human autonomy versus divine authority.
So those are the human motivations: fear, pride, desire for autonomous security. How do God's actions and motivations contrast with all that? Why does he intervene?
Well, his intervention isn't arbitrary or, spiteful. It's a direct response to those motivations and, more importantly, to the potential outcome of those motivations.
You mentioned that line, nothing will be restrained from them.
Yes. And again, it's not that God feels threatened. It's about the destructive potential of unified, unchecked human ambition operating without divine guidance or moral boundaries. Imagine humanity, perfectly coordinated by one language, able to achieve anything they collectively imagine without reference to God's will or goodness.
That sounds dangerous, potentially catastrophic.
Exactly. It could lead to unprecedented levels of hubris, tyranny, and evil. God intervenes to prevent that destructive trajectory, to put a check on that potentially limitless self-focused power. It's almost a mercy, in a way, preventing humanity from reaching a point of no return in its rebellion.
So preventing unchecked ambition. What else?
Ensuring the fulfillment of his own will. The scattering is definitely a judgment on their pride and disobedience. They refuse to scatter, so God makes them scatter.
Right.
But paradoxically, that judgment actually achieves the original command. They do end up filling the earth, spreading out, diversifying. It's a divine redirection. God's ultimate purpose for populating the earth is fulfilled, even though it happens through judgment on human sin rather than through willing obedience. His plan prevails.
Wow, that's quite a paradox.
Yeah.
Judgment fulfilling the command. Okay, this is where we can really pull back and see the big theological themes woven through these chapters. They're packed with meaning.
Oh, incredibly rich, foundational stuff.
Let's start with that obvious one, hubris and pride.
Yeah. The Tower of Babel is just the ultimate symbol of human hubris, isn't it? It's humanity grabbing for control, trying to dictate its own destiny, achieve fame and security through its own collective might, its own technology.
Building their own kingdom instead of participating in God's.
Precisely. It's a spiritual rebellion, making a name for themselves, not glorifying God. It echoes Eden, wanting to be like God, autonomous, self-sufficient. It's a powerful warning against that kind of pride that tries to elbow God out of the picture.
Then there's this tension you mentioned between unity and diversity.
Right. The story starts with unity, one language, one people. But that unity is directed against God's command. So God intervenes and creates diversity, many languages, scattered peoples.
So is diversity just a punishment? Or is there more to it?
That's the question it forces us to ask. It is consequence of judgment, yes. But could it also be God's way of ensuring the earth gets filled, as commanded? And maybe preventing an even worse monolithic rebellion. It suggests that diversity, even born from judgment, can serve God's purposes. Maybe true unity isn't about everyone being the same, but about harmony among different parts.
That's a really interesting thought. Okay, third theme, God's direct involvement.
Divine intervention. It's undeniable here. God isn't distant. He comes down, he sees, he assesses, he acts. He actively intervenes to thwart plans that oppose his will for creation.
It underlines his sovereignty.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His sovereignty, his ongoing engagement with human history, he's shaping destiny even when people try to go their own way. God is actively involved.
And finally, the origin of languages and peoples.
From a biblical viewpoint, these chapters provide the theological explanation for the incredible ethno-linguistic diversity we see. It posits this common origin, then a specific event, Babel, that caused linguistic fragmentation and geographic dispersion. It directly connects the Table of Nations map in Chapter 10 to the Confusion of Tongues event in Chapter 11. It gives a coherent theological framework for understanding how we got all these different peoples and languages.
Okay, to really get the full impact, we need to understand the world these stories came from, the cultural and historical context. You mentioned ziggurats earlier.
Yes, that's crucial. For anyone living in ancient Mesopotamia, hearing about a tower whose top may reach unto heaven would immediately bring ziggurats to mind. These massive step temple towers were everywhere. Where Abram came from, had a famous one.
So they weren't just random towers. They had religious significance.
Huge significance. They were seen as sacred mountains, connection points between heaven and earth. A place for the gods to come down, for humans to go up and worship, often a shrine right at the top. They dominated the city landscape and the religious imagination.
And the building materials mentioned, brick and slime.
Exactly matches Mesopotamian practice. Baked brick and bitumen mortar. That detail shows the author knew the region, knew the technology. It grounds the story in reality. The Tower of Babel isn't just a fairy tale. It's engaging with, maybe even critiquing, a very real and ambitious aspect of Mesopotamian culture.
That adds so much depth. What about the genealogies themselves? Were lists like the Table of Nations common back then?
Oh yes, very common across the ancient Near East. Genealogies were super important. They established identity, who you were, where you came from. They established legitimacy, especially for kings and priests, tracing their line back. They also mapped out political relationships between different groups.
So how is the Genesis Table of Nations different?
While it shares that basic form, it does something unique. It doesn't just list names and places, it weaves it all into a theological narrative. It connects the dispersion of peoples and the origin of languages directly to God's actions, God's judgment, and God's overarching plan. It gives divine meaning to the ethnic and political landscape, which other ancient lists didn't necessarily do in the same way. It's history interpreted theologically.
Okay, this brings us to what feels like the most critical takeaway. How these two chapters function as a turning point in Genesis. The end of one era, the setup for the next.
You've nailed it. The Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11 marks the end of what we call the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11. Up till now, the focus has been universal. God dealing with humanity as a whole. Creation, fall, flood, Babel. It's all global scale.
And Babel feels like the climax of that universal story, the ultimate point of fragmentation.
Exactly. It presents the final problem of the primeval history. Humanity is now completely fractured. linguistically divided, geographically scattered, alienated from each other and from God. The command to fill the earth is done, but in a broken, judged way.
So the big question hanging in the air at the end of chapter 11 is, now what? How can God possibly bless this scattered, confused mess?
That's precisely the tension. How can reconciliation happen? How can blessing reach all these alienated nations? The universal problem is laid bare.
And that problem immediately sets the stage for God's radically new solution.
Yes, the universal problem demands a new approach, and that approach begins instantly in Genesis 12. God shifts strategy. Instead of dealing with everyone all at once, he chooses one man, Abram.
Whose lineage we just carefully traced.
Exactly. Abram from Ur of the Chaldees, that's center of human ambition,
Yeah.
and his wife Sarai introduced as barren. Talk about starting with impossibility.
So God moves from the universal to the particular, from all nations to one family.
It's a radical shift, a counterintuitive strategy almost. To solve a universal problem by focusing on one specific, seemingly unremarkable individual and his barren wife.
But this chosen family, this single thread, becomes the means to bless everyone else, to fix the Babel problem.
That's the incredible plan. God's choice of Abram isn't just for Abram's sake. It's designed ultimately to bring blessing and redemption back to all the scattered nations, the very nations mapped out in chapter 10 and fragmented in chapter 11.
The promise in Genesis 12, in you all families of the earth will be blessed.
That's it right there. It's God's regathering strategy. He'll work through this particular family to eventually reverse the effects of Babel, to bring spiritual unity and blessing back to all the diverse families of the earth. It sets the entire trajectory for the rest of the Bible. Salvation history unfolding through this chosen line for the sake of the whole world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Genesis 10 and 11, wow, it's clear these chapters are just packed with profound insights, not just about where nations and languages came from, but about who we are as humans, our drives, our fears.
Absolutely. That detailed map of nations, the unforgettable drama of Babel, it's a powerful story about human ambition clashing with divine purpose.
And that enduring tension you mentioned, our desire to make a name for ourselves, build our own security, versus God's bigger plan.
Exactly. And the scattering, while it was a consequence of that pride, also served God's purpose of filling the earth with diverse peoples. It created the very world that God then set out to redeem through Abraham.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listeners, to reflect on. We've seen this powerful human drive to make a name for ourselves,
Yeah.
right? To build monuments, whether literal towers or, careers or legacies.
Things that show I was here.
Yeah. How do we, in our own lives, in our communities, in our work, how do we tell the difference between ambition that's actually good, ambition that builds up, that blesses others, that maybe even contributes to a healthy, God-honoring diversity,
Yeah.
versus that self-glorifying pride we saw at Babel, the kind that ends up creating confusion and alienation?
That's a tough discernment, isn't it?
It really is. What kind of name are we truly trying to make? And maybe more importantly, on whose terms are we building? Something to definitely chew on as we think about these ancient but incredibly relevant stories and how they still speak right into our lives today.